Friends, today's topic is from the 16th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, which is two paths, the divine and the demonic. Now, when I first prepared this talk some weeks ago, I wondered how I could present it to you. The subject, divine and demonic, good and evil, seemed so stark and cold. Where is the application, the relevance in our lives? Where is the inspiration for this topic? Then came the war in Ukraine. And we see so clearly images on the screen of the dynamic, the divine, the heroism and self-sacrifice. And we also see the stark images of the demonic, a corrupt ego's lust for power and land and desire to achieve it at whatever cost of human life, destruction, and suffering. Our hearts break, and we ask ourselves, how can Vedanta put this in some kind of context, some kind of perspective that deepens our understanding of a divine being and its relationship to such catastrophic suffering? So here the Gita comes to our rescue. Sublime teachings given to the warrior Arjuna on the battlefield of life. What greater urgency for spiritual relevance can there be than at the time of war, at the time of crisis? Wartime puts these forces of good and evil into a context that we can view through a higher lens, and in this case, coming from God himself, Sri Krishna. And in this catastrophic war in Ukraine, we are witness to the forces of the divine and the demonic, heroism versus arrogance, bloodlust, and greed. Once a young monk asked Swami Brahmananda, why is the mind sometimes calm and tranquil and can think higher thoughts, but then again becomes restless and loses all interest? Why? And the Swami replied, these are the workings of the gunas. And here gunas refer to the energy of the mind. So the sway of the gunas, sattva, rajas, tamas, tranquility, activity, inertia, cause our mood swings. Our mental states fluctuate according to the predominance of any one guna at any one particular time. And this is why, in most people, including ourselves, we can see both noble and ignoble qualities. We can see love, sympathy, generosity, purity, or hatred, anger, untruthfulness, miserliness, and selfishness. So why are some people born with higher mental tendencies and others with lower tendencies? Swami Pravrajika in his Gita commentary reminds us, the theory of reincarnation explains that each individual has had past lives. Those who are born with good tendencies have had a past, and likewise those with evil tendencies, but all have a future to evolve spiritually. All have a future to evolve spiritually. So this theory of karma points to the importance of understanding how the mind works. The more we know how the mind works, the greater we will know how to control the mind. So each act that we performed, mental or physical, leaves a mental residue in our mind called a samskara, a tendency to repeat itself, to repeat the same act. And that is how our habits are made. And the culmination of these habits form our character. For example, if someone insults you and you get angry, every time you see that person, that angry samskara comes up. And pretty soon it unleashes itself in an outburst, and then in another outburst towards a person completely disassociated with that original person. And so it goes on until we become what is called an angry person. So that is how samskara works. And that is why we as aspirants try to be so vigilant in overlooking these tendencies of the mind. Though yoga teaches us that what we are today is due to our past actions, mental and physical, it also teaches us that if we can manage our present, we can plan and change our future. So it's a very, very positive, upward teaching. This control of the mind. Sri Krishna teaches us that when we create a habit, that habit forms a tendency, good or bad. And when we follow an ethical life and practice spirituality, a spiritually motivated habits, whatever they may be, from ablutions before our morning meditation to karma yoga in our workplace, we begin to cultivate divine qualities and gradually become established in sattva, tranquility, light. Then it becomes impossible ever to commit a misdeed. Our future lies in our hands. So what are those noble qualities we wish to attain? Sri Krishna explains in the Bhagavad Gita, 16th chapter, verses 1 through 3. He says, a man, and he's speaking to Arjuna on the battlefield, a man who is born with tendencies toward the divine is fearless and pure in heart. He perseveres in that path to union with Brahman, which the scriptures and his teachers have taught him. He is charitable. He can control his passions. He studies the scriptures regularly and obeys their directions. He practices spiritual disciplines. He is straightforward, truthful, and of an even temper. He harms no one. He renounces the things of this world. He has a tranquil mind and an unmalicious tongue. He is compassionate toward all. He is not greedy. He is gentle and modest. He abstains from useless activity. He continues. He has faith in the strength of his higher nature. He has faith in the strength of his higher nature. He can forgive and endure. He is clean in thought and act. He is free from hatred and from pride. Such qualities are his birthright. So let's go into some of these qualities. When Sri Krishna says, a man who is born with tendencies toward the divine is fearless and pure in heart. Well, few people are truly fearless. Some people like to think they are, and they act out, but that is not fearlessness. Fearlessness is something we as aspirants can cultivate. As long as we are dependent on anyone or anything, we're bound to have fear. But when we can take complete refuge in God, we no longer have anything to fear. Complete refuge in God. What is that? A poignant example of this fearlessness is seen in the Persian mystic, poet, Mansar Halaj, who was condemned to hang by the neck for proclaiming in ecstasy, An-Halak, I am the truth. Al-Haq, the truth, is one of 99 names of Allah, God with attributes. When he was tortured and put to death for heresy, he never stopped smiling in ecstasy as he uttered that dictum, akin to a knower of Brahman proclaiming, Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. That is complete refuge. It's a spiritual experience, a state of attainment. So spiritual realization itself triumphs any act of violence. Swami Brahmananda inspired his disciples, be a God, that you may know the infinite God. In that knowledge, there is neither want nor fear. The very thought of such knowledge is uplifting. Be established in your own self, the lion of Vedanta. But how can we attain such knowledge? How can we do that at this point in our lives? Step by step. What are some of the practical tools? For those following the path of jnana, one is Vivekananda's strength-giving meditation on the heart of a lion. Know you are free. Feel that. Know you are established in that truth. Affirm it every day. It's like polishing a vessel. We have to do it every day. Otherwise, it loses its sheen. For the devotees, Swami Pravrajika beautifully described in his Gita commentary, we can develop that fearlessness through practice. The Lord dwells in the shrine of each heart. And when we meditate and pray, we must learn to go to that inner sanctuary where nothing can touch us. If we can make this our regular daily practice, we will eventually find that we no longer have any fear. So it takes daily practice, step by step, 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. Again, we practice again, and gradually we move forward. Once a former nun who left the convent complained to Swami Prabhupada, I don't feel I'm going anywhere in my spiritual practice. And we all feel that way at one time or another. And the Swami said to her, you are on the train, and the train is moving, whether you are asleep or awake. So once you cross the threshold and take up spiritual life, you are on the train. Sri Krishna says he perseveres in that path to union with Brahman, which the scriptures and his teacher have taught him. So by perseverance, Sri Krishna is reminding us to develop regularity in our spiritual practices, sticking steadfastly to our daily meditations. Learning to fix our minds on God at the time of our day's work is another form, so that our work becomes worship. Otherwise, it just remains karma that binds. Even good works, if they're not done in the spirit of worship, is karma. It's meritorious. It may make you a good person, but not a God-realized person. So that is surrendering our works, working as worship, rather than karma. So karma yoga that liberates us. Chanting the name of God throughout the day. Then every breath becomes bhakti yoga. It's true, this happens. Using the mantra, then the mantra begins to use us. In the beginning, we make a conscious effort to keep the mantra going on within. We never utter it in the presence of others. It is something that we repeat inwardly, and that takes practice. Then we find it begins to come automatically when our mind is in a default mode. Say when we're driving our car, when we're washing the dishes, or when we're stirring a food preparation on the stove. This is not a spiritual experience. This is what the mantra does. One longtime Santa Barbara devotee who used to go to the YMCA regularly to swim her laps told me, Brahmaprana, when I'm doing my freestyle laps in the pool, my mantra comes with every breath. Yes, this is how it happens. It's simply what the mantra does. It becomes a part of our breathing when the mind is relaxed. And all those repetitions are purifying because the mantra is sacred energy that works on our body and our mind and transforms us over time. So perseverance in our sadhana is a key to success. Swami Saradananda, disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, first gave us self-confidence by explaining, you complain that thoughts of duty sometimes intrude when you sit for meditation. All minds are in the same predicament, he tells us. Then, but if through God's grace it becomes firmly impressed on your mind that the world is impermanent, and if the idea that God alone is your true goal takes a grip on your heart, then this kind of unsteadiness of the mind will be greatly eliminated. That this world is impermanent. This is what Jnana Yoga teaches us. God alone is our true goal. Then everything becomes spiritualized in our life. So perseverance also implies patience. Buddha said, we can prepare the soil in a hurry. We can fertilize it in a hurry. We can plant the seeds in a hurry. And we can continue watering the seeds, but they will take their own time to germinate. One disciple of Swami Brahmananda explained similarly, at the time of initiation, the guru plants a seed, the mantra, in the heart of the student. The student in turn struggles to nourish it by repeating it. But while that seed takes time to germinate, the student must persevere patiently. Swami Bhuteshananda, former president of the Ramakrishna order, disciple of Swami Saradananda, was once asked what happens at the time of initiation. And he said, the guru plants the seed of Brahman in the heart of the devotee. And then, as a devotee waters it, feeds the soil, that little seed grows into a sapling, then into the tree of Brahman, which bears fruits. He has a tranquil mind and an unmalicious tongue. Now, it's human nature to gossip, but that does have a negative effect on the fault finder. Yes. How? First, Swami Premananda explained, when one goes on finding fault with others, one becomes imperceptibly infected with those faults because it's a form of meditation. If you're really finding fault, you're meditating on those faults. Second, as aspirants, we must strive to acquire love and sympathy for all. Otherwise, we're not growing spiritually. We're just, we're just staying in one place. Third, when we remember the goal to become self-realized, when that happens, we automatically see that same self in all, not just within ourselves. When we have a genuine experience, we feel that self within ourselves and we see it within others. Yes, it's universal. So we must strive to make the revelation the practice in order to attain our goal. That is what our spiritual practices are. They come from the revelation. Sri Krishna says he has faith in the strength of his higher nature. Swami Vivekananda emphasized this truth again and again in so many ways. At the Chicago Parliament of Religions, he said, "Children of immortal bliss, what a sweet, what a hopeful name. Ye divinities on earth, sinners, it is a sin to call a man a sinner. It is a sin to call a man so. It is a standing libel on human nature." Then he would expose the obstacle to this truth. We are hypnotizing ourselves every day into believing that our true nature is less than divine. That is why daily meditation is so important, to polish that pot, to remind ourselves, to invoke those qualities within that lead to that realization. Swami Premananda explained egoism. It is truly hellish. It is this egoism that has kept the whole world under delusion. Only with the greatest of austerity can one be completely freed from ego. But without faith in ourselves, we can have no faith in God, the Supreme Self who dwells within all. So our teachers tell us, yes, we may have bad tendencies. Surely we all do. We're not perfect. We're striving for perfection, but we can overcome them. What we think, we become. If we think we are a sinner and impure, we become that. But by meditating on our innate strength and perfection, we become strong and perfect. He can forgive and endure. Once upon a time, King Kaushika entered a forest to hunt, and he met the sage Vashishta. Vashishta invited the king to be a guest in his hermitage, and there he fed the king and his army with milk from his cow Nandini. That was a gift from the god Indra. But King Kaushika demanded the cow for himself. However, the sage refused him. Angered, the king commanded his soldiers to take the cow by force, but was defeated by Vashishta's miraculous powers. King Kaushika then realized his military power was inferior to spiritual powers, so he renounced his kingdom and retired to the forest to practice austerities. After attaining some level of spiritual growth, he returned to the sage Vashishta and demanded to be recognized as a Brahmarshi, the highest class of sages. "No," Vashishta replied, "you are only a Rajarshi, a royal sage." Disappointed, King Kaushika returned to the forest to practice more austerities. Years later, again, he returned to Vashishta, but the seer recognized him as a Maharshi, a great sage, but one level lower than a Brahmarshi. "Won't you recognize me as a Brahmarshi?" King Kaushika challenged defiantly. "How can I?" Vashishta returned. "I don't see that quality in you." This angered the king, and he vowed to hold a special fire sacrifice to kill Vashishta, a sacrifice that Vashishta himself would have to perform. But toward the end of the sacrifice, the king began to relent and told the sage, "No, I won't allow you to be killed." But the sage replied, "As a priest, I must complete the sacrifice that I perform." Whereupon King Kaushika suddenly stood up and poured water onto the fire, completely aborting the sacrifice. Vashishta then declared, "Now I call you a Brahmarshi. Before this, you had harbored wounded feelings and a grudge, but now Even though you had complete control over me, still you forgave me. Verses 4 and 5 of chapter 16. When a man is born with demonic tendencies, his birthright is hypocrisy, arrogance, conceit, anger, cruelty, and ignorance. The birthright of the divine nature leads to liberation. The birthright of the demonic nature leads to greater bondage. But you need not fear, Arjuna. Your birthright is divine. About demonic tendencies, we have commentaries from Sri Ramakrishna. What about hypocrisy? Sri Ramakrishna says, one cannot be guileless without a great deal of spiritual discipline in previous lives. This simplicity is such a virtue. The mind cannot be convoluted by calculation. That is simplicity. About arrogance, Sri Ramakrishna said, God cannot be realized if there is the slightest trace of pride. Pride in one's spiritual practices is pride. What is the solution to such a stern sentence that most of us could not live up to? Complete absence of pride? Sri Ramakrishna says, if you cannot get rid of pride, then be proud to say that you are a servant of God. You are the child of God. Thus, turn the 6 passions, meaning lust, anger, greed, ignorance, of I and mine, pride and shame, toward God. So it's like spiritual jujitsu. And we thus progress. The birthright of the divine nature leads to liberation, Krishna says. But how does that apply to us? Sri Krishna assures Arjuna, whoever searches for the truth of God possesses the prerequisite divine qualities to unfold their divine nature. In other words, all of you have those prerequisite divine qualities within you. Verse 6. In this world, there are 2 kinds of beings, those whose nature tends towards the divine and those who have the demonic tendencies. I have already described the divine nature to you in some detail. Now you shall learn more about the demonic nature. Hold on, there's quite a long list. But why should Arjuna need to know about demonic tendencies? Why should we need to know? The teachers tell us, within each of us, there exists some of these demonic tendencies that we must be able to recognize and overcome. Yes, as we go towards the east, the west is left behind, but the mind also becomes very, very subtle and is able to shine the light within the mind to see the hidden caverns there, and thus has the strength to clear out those caverns, those demonic tendencies. They may be small, but as we progress in our spiritual life, then we also work on the internal that are holding us back. We have the strength to do that. So we need not be frightened. As we advance in spiritual life, we then have the strength to face the subconscious mind and root out these adverse qualities, however predominant or subtle, that hinder us. Verse 7, men of demonic nature, this is Sri Krishna, neither know what they ought to do nor what they should refrain from doing. There is no truth of them, or purity, or right conduct. Swami Chidbhavananda explains verse 7. He said, truthfulness, purity, and dharma are other names of the reality. If we remember the definition of dharma, that in itself inspires us to stay straight on the path of dharmic living. And what does dharma mean? Swami Sri Dharananda beautifully explained it one time when he was here. He said, that which prevents our personality from disintegrating. We may not have the purity to recognize that disintegration, but a real teacher does. Once Sri Ramakrishna called Rakal, the future Swami Brahmananda, to him and said, have you told a lie? No, master. Think back. Your face is clouded over with a dark veil. Raka then said, oh, today I told a lie, but only in jest. The master sternly replied, never tell a lie, not even in jest. Here he was speaking to an Ishvarakoti. So even a small deviation is a serious flaw. Why, we may ask? Because the root, why this? Because the root of satya, truthfulness, is sat, pure existence. Without truthfulness, we cannot realize the truth. Verses 8 through 12. Sri Krishna says, they maintain that the scriptures are a lie. He's talking about those of demonic nature. And that the universe is not based upon a moral law, but godless, conceived in lust and created by copulation without any other cause. He goes on, because they believe this in the darkness of their little minds, these degraded creatures do horrible deeds, attempting to destroy the world. They are enemies of mankind. And of course, we see this today in Ukraine, wrongfully violated by Russia. Krishna continues, their lust can never be appeased. They are arrogant and vain and drunk with pride. They run blindly after what is evil. The ends they work for are unclean. They are sure that life has only one purpose, gratification of the senses. And so they are plagued by innumerable cares from which death alone can release them. Anxiety binds them with 100 chains, delivering them over to lust and wrath. They are ceaselessly busy, piling up dishonest gains to satisfy their cravings. They maintain that the scriptures are a lie. And here Sri Krishna is referring to materialists and hedonists. Because they believe this in the darkness of their little minds, Sri Krishna is saying, in this verse, he's pointing out that those who excessively pursue sense pleasures fritter away their discrimination and capacity for deeper thought. That is the law. You see, the more we can self-control, the more we have the capacity for deeper thought. The more the mind becomes luminous, and the intellect also becomes luminous. They are sure that life has only one purpose, gratification of the senses, Krishna says. But this sense gratification doesn't end with death. It's buried deep in one's subtle body, the mind. And that is the part of us that transmigrates. It's ready to remanifest in the next birth. Now, here comes a very important philosophical point. Sri Ramakrishna compares this mindless sense gratification to a camel that bites off thorny bushes, unmindful that it causes bleeding in its mouth. It's beautiful. Ironically, the nature of this pleasure is, in fact, pain. It binds the mind and causes us to fear the loss of our pleasure. Anxiety binds us with 100 chains. We read every day how tax evaders and those in power who deprive their employees of basic benefits are summoned to courts of justice. They're accused of preying on their underlings in order to build and safeguard their ever-growing billion-dollar fortunes. By not providing basic benefits, the length of their workers' employment is short-lived, so their company's profit margin remains high. These are examples of asura tendencies, demonic tendencies. Verses 13 through 16, Sri Krishna says, I wanted this and today I got it. I wanted that and I shall get it tomorrow. All these riches are now mine. Soon I shall have more. I have killed this enemy. I will kill all the rest. I am a ruler of men. I enjoy the things of this world. I am successful, strong, and happy. Who is my equal? I am so wealthy and so nobly born. I will sacrifice to the gods. I will give alms. I will make merry. That is what they say to themselves in the blindness of their ignorance, Krishna says. He ends, they are addicts of sensual pleasure, made restless by their many desires and caught in the net of delusion. They fall into the filthy hell of their own evil minds. All these riches are now mine. Soon I shall have more. So this is the nature of our human condition. Eknath Ishwaran expresses it aptly in his commentary. He says the very nature of the mind is to desire, to desire, to desire. If desires could be satisfied once and for all, the mind would be out of a job. This is the nature of the mind. Who is my equal? I am so wealthy and so nobly born. So here, such a person's worship is primarily for self-glorification. Sri Ramakrishna was a master psychologist. Nangta, he said, meaning Totapuri, his sannyas guru, told me of a certain king who gave a feast to the sadhus using plates and tumblers of gold. I noticed in the monasteries at Benares with what great respect the abbots were treated. Many wealthy upcountry people stood before them with folded hands, ready to obey their commands. But a true sadhu, he said, a man who has really renounced everything, seeks neither a gold plate nor honor. God sees that he lacks nothing. God gives the devotee everything that is needed for realizing him. They are addicts of sensual pleasure, made restless by their many desires. So whatever is in one's mind is projected on the external world and then thought to be the reality. For the worldly minded, a mirage that fools us into believing the unreal is real. For the spiritually minded, in a state of consciousness as that of the jnani, he sees the subtle duality of this as opposed to that. The external world is seen as Maya, a dream, unreal as opposed to Brahman, upon which it rests. For without Brahman, Maya, the mirage, cannot exist. Brahman can exist without Maya, but Maya cannot exist without Brahman. But in another state of consciousness, that of the Vijnani, one sees this world as a mansion of mirth, a divine play of Satchidananda. The Vijnani sees form as Brahman, a pulsation of consciousness, whereas the Jnani sees form as unreal and Brahman residing within form. Two subtle differences. Verses 17 through 20. Conceited, haughty, foolishly proud, and intoxicated by their wealth, they offer sacrifice to God in name only, for outward show, without following the sacred rituals. These malignant creatures are full of egoism, vanity, lust, wrath, and consciousness of power, Sri Krishna says. They loathe me and deny my presence, both in themselves and in others. He goes on, they are enemies of all men and of myself, cruel, despicable, and vile. I cast them back again and again into the wombs of degraded parents, subjecting them to the wheel of birth and death. And so they are constantly reborn in degradation and delusion. They do not reach me, but sink down to the lowest possible condition of the soul. Now, here, this law of causation, this law of karma, gives us a broader perspective of what is happening around us. Intoxicated by their wealth, they offer sacrifice to God in name only for outward show. So we see warmongers attending church services. Yes. Such people make a lavish display of religion for self-advertisement, which can fool some devotees, but Sri Krishna exposes them for what they are. They are not devotees, but charlatans. In the verses that follow, Sri Krishna lists numerous demonic human tendencies that can overtake the worldly minded, who may even go to their church, synagogue, or temple for show, but deny the presence of God within themselves and others. I cast them back again and again. Now here, Swami Nikhilananda in his commentary explains what seems to be a dire fate. And this is the beauty of Vedanta. The demonic nature leads to a series of evil results inimical to all human progress. An individual should therefore try to shake it off while he is yet a free agent and while he has not yet passed into a birth that would completely shut him off from the divine light. In Vedanta philosophy, creation does not mean absolute creation, but only creation at the beginning of a cycle. The creation itself is without beginning. The devas, souls with spiritual attributes, and asuras, souls with demonic attributes, representing the forces of good and evil, are ever present in the relative world of the three gunas. Both are necessary to the evolution of the relative universe. It's a very, very sobering, very deep concept. It is not meant that the human souls are so created by God from the beginning that they must be good or evil. Nor is it meant that there is a rigid spiritual predestination, that some are rejected from the beginning by the Lord and blinded by him, so that they must be thrust down to eternal damnation. Souls are born with spiritual or demonic attributes in accordance with the law of karma. The power of the Lord, which acts like a light, may be used for a good or an evil purpose, according to man's nature. And here is the culmination. But all souls, the asuras as well as the devas, are eternal portions of the Lord, and all will one day realize their spiritual heritage. So there is no eternal damnation in Vedanta. Our teachers remind us there comes a time when the divinity within even the most degraded souls will assert itself, and they will begin to strive for perfection. None will be lost. And we see this play in the lives of the avatars. In Christ, in his life, with those who are, quote unquote, sinners. We see it in the life of Sri Ramakrishna with Girish Ghosh, who claimed there was no sin he had not committed. But Sri Ramakrishna lifted him up to sainthood. My teacher, Swami Pravrajika, before he came to the West, he went to Girish Ghosh's house in Kolkata. And when he entered, he said it had the atmosphere of holiness. And Girish was pacing back and forth, and he had 3 stenographers, and he was dictating lines to plays, poems, articles, etc. He kept 3 stenographers busy. And suddenly there was a knock on the door. And a monk from the magazine of our order came and said, Girish, you promised us a poem on Sri Ramakrishna. It's time for publication. We need the poem. And Girish stopped, and right then and there, he composed the poem. Such brilliance of mind and such saintliness that came through at the end. Sri Ramakrishna lifted him up. As Sri Krishna promises in chapter 6, verses 40 to 45, though we may all fail many times to rise to perfection, our true nature within, the Atman, will ultimately prevail and lift each individual upward. Eventually, in future births. Swami Prabhupada in his commentary explains all that is needed is a little desire for God. And when that desire grows stronger, a struggling soul, no matter how degraded from past actions, will gain strength from within and will be lifted up. Verses 21 to 24. Sri Krishna tells us, hell has 3 doors, lust, rage, and greed. These lead to man's ruin. Therefore, he must avoid them all. He who passes by these 3 dark doors has achieved his own salvation. He will reach the highest goal at last. But he who flouts the commandments of the scriptures and acts on the impulse of his desires cannot reach perfection or happiness or the highest goal. Let the scriptures be your guide, he says. Therefore, in deciding what you must do and what you must abstain from, first learn the path of action as the scriptures teach it, then act accordingly. So in this chapter, Sri Krishna lays the bare, sobering truth. There are 2 paths to follow, good and evil. But if we take the help of the scriptures and a genuine guru from a reputed lineage, there's no fear that we may misdirect the divine power that lies within us and fall from the goal. The scriptures and our guru are here to remind us to develop discrimination and help us to adhere to the path of good, to find real happiness. Otherwise, if we take the path of the pleasant, we'll eventually discover for ourselves that our pleasure is never really satisfied and never brings us happiness. So the sages encourage us, in the beginning, the path of the good may be difficult, but in the end, one attains the supreme goal.